Hey guys, I'm your host, Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to this week's episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Kaihan, Bizarre Crimes That Shook Japan Volume 2 is now out. If you're interested in learning more about some of the most bizarre, strange, and even terrifying crimes that have taken place in Japan over the last few decades, then make sure to grab your copy now. You can find 25 new cases of missing persons, unsolved mysteries, and truly bizarre crimes that still confuse people today. That's Kaihan, Bizarre Crimes That Shook Japan Volume 2, out now. This week, we're heading to the island of Shikoku for a variety of scares, both ancient and modern. This area is famous for the Shikoku pilgrimage that takes you around the island to see 88 different temples. But of course, that's not all you'll find down there. First up, an interesting tale from a local temple tells of a scroll with a sutra recorded on it that possesses tremendous power. But what happens if you break the one taboo associated with it? Find out in Sutra. There are probably stories of defeated soldiers fleeing the enemy from all around the country. The most famous is probably Minamoto no Yoshitsune, but there's also a story of a fleeing soldier where I live now in Shikoku as well. The legend states that he was a young emperor who drowned at the Battle of Dan-no-ura, but in reality he escaped, passed through our area, and then crossed the sea to head further south. When the emperor and his company stayed at a family temple in our village, they gifted a sutra written by the emperor to the chief priest at the time as thanks. That's how the story goes, and that sutra is still there in the temple. But now, it's worm-eaten and full of holes. But it isn't silverfish or whatever that have made the holes, but rather, the small characters on the scripture have been cut out as tiny little square holes. Supposedly, back when people didn't know much about medicine and there were no doctors around, people who were ill visited the chief priest, and he would carefully cut out a single character from the sutra and then give it to them. The ill would then chant as they swallowed the character. In modern medicine, we'd think of this as nothing more than a placebo, but apparently there were actually people who got better afterwards. So, the scary story happened somewhere around the start of the Edo period, when someone from a fishing village got sick. The fisherman's elderly mother visited the temple, received one of the characters from the sutra, then gave it to her son. But he didn't show any signs of getting better. On that note, there were some characters that you absolutely must never cut from the sutra, and those were the two characters that made up the emperor's name. Apparently, a legend passed down over the years that those two characters alone you must not take. But because the fisherman was on the verge of death, his mother hoped against hope that those two characters might actually save him. So she snuck into the storehouse of the temple and cut them out. Then she gave them to her son. Suddenly, his condition improved. The fisherman was so happy that he let his mother sleep on the other side of his partitioned storehouse. But that night, he was awakened by the sound of rushing water. The sound seemed to be coming from where his mother slept. He got up and drew back the straw curtain, and was shocked by what he saw. That small storehouse was full of water, and his mother was nowhere to be seen. Instead, all he could find was a white creature, around 6 feet long, that he couldn't quite tell whether it was a squid or an octopus. That creature, perhaps noticing the sudden light, then pushed the stunned fisherman aside and crawled back to the sea. They never saw the fisherman's mother ever again. It's believed that the legends of Inugami, where one is possessed by the spirit of a dog, first began in Shikoku, and in this next story, a young girl apparently runs into a family dealing with one. But what's really going on? Find out in House Haunted by the Inugami. This happened when my mother visited her grandmother in the countryside. Where her grandmother lived, there was a house that people were told never to go near because the family was haunted by an Inugami. I guess that family was ostracized by all the others because of it. Everyone kept their distance, and people were told never to walk the path near that house and such too. When she was just a child and went to visit her grandmother one time, a woman from that house called out to my mother while she was playing. "Come on, I'll show you some puppies," she said. Being a child, she didn't know anything about the house or the rumors surrounding it, so she went in to see the dogs. It was right around rice planting season, so the grown-ups were all busy with that and didn't notice she was gone. Anyway, when she went inside, she found a cardboard box in a drawer in the closet. Inside were 5 puppies. Why are they in the closet? She wondered. But either way, she remarked on how cute they were, and then, when she heard her grandmother calling for her, she ran out of the house. When she got back, her grandmother got really angry at her. But then she asked, "Were there any dogs?" "Yeah, there were," she answered. "I knew it," her grandmother then muttered. My mother never saw or spoke to anyone from that house again after that. But even now, her grandmother's house is still out there. My mother was only let into the room with the closet and heated table, so she never saw the other rooms. You often hear about families being possessed or haunted by Inugami, but I don't know. The only thing for sure is that the locals out there really don't like that family. This next story is perhaps a little more modern, and if you've never had a reason to be scared of musical instruments before, well, perhaps this one might change your mind. Find out why in Classic Guitar. There was this music shop in Kochi that was the subject of a lot of talk because of an apparent haunting. It seemed that one of the guitars there, that was on display, was possessed. It was this really old classic guitar with a crack in the body, about 2 centimeters long and 5 millimeters wide. Of course, it didn't produce very nice sounds, so the store manager bought it for incredibly cheap. Apparently, it came from overseas and was rather old, so he thought it would be nice as a display guitar. Of course, they could repair it, but it still wouldn't be worth much, and he thought the crack looked kind of neat, so he put a price on it that might appeal to street performers and the like. But after he put this guitar up for display, customers started saying strange things about it, like they claimed to see the shadow of a person between that guitar and the others, even when nobody else was in the shop. Or sometimes, they claimed to see feet on the other side of the score sheet shelf when nobody else was there. Another person claimed to see a reflection behind them in the automatic doors when they were paying at the register, even though no one was there. Maybe they just saw things wrong, but several of these weird stories then started to pass around like rumors. No doubt some people visited the shop out of curiosity. But then one day, the store suddenly closed. According to what I heard, a street performer was interested in the guitar with the crack and picked it up. The store manager told him that it was cracked, so it was just a display item and not good for much else. Suddenly, the customer seemed to have an idea and looked at the crack through the hole. On the other side of that crack, he said someone was looking at him, as though their face was pressed right against the guitar. This person's eyes were bloodshot and wide open and filled the entire crack. Now, there's no trace of the music shop anymore. In this next story, children like to run around and pretend they're being chased by an imaginary ghost. But is the ghost really imaginary? What if there's actually something more sinister at work here? Find out what's going on in Doudou. I've got some free time, so I guess I'll write about an occult experience I had in the past. Looking back on it now, this experience is probably why I'm interested in the occult now. When I was in the lower grades of elementary school, I often played a game with my friend Kay called Doudou. Around 6 to 6:30 p.m, roughly the time we went home, one of us would start screaming, "Doudou! Doudou!" as we ran home. Doudou was an imaginary monster that Kay made up, and the idea was that this monster appeared around evening time to steal children. Because we were running around screaming, we got pretty worked up, and because that time of night was kind of creepy, I remember it being quite a scary game for us kids. So one day, I think it was in October or November, we were playing Doudou when one of the old guys from nearby, I think he was 70 at the time, but he has since passed away, suddenly got angry at us. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop saying Doudou. If you get taken away, it's your own fault." He was normally so kind, and I didn't really understand why he was getting angry at us, so I was almost in tears. Confused, I looked at Kay, who was the one who came up with the game. But something about him was weird. His expression was weird, like something I'd never seen before. How can I put it? Kind of like his face was warped and twisted, and he was muttering something I couldn't understand. As the old man looked at him, his face went more and more pale. "Oh no, Kay's been possessed! Quick, call the priest!" Looking back on it now, it was an incredibly valuable experience, but I was so shocked that I don't really remember what happened after that. From what I heard, Kay was taken to see the nearby chief priest, who then cleansed him. And then he missed the next week of school after that. And I don't know if he even remembered it or not, but he never said the word Doudou again after that. I was also too scared to ever ask him about it. So, time passed, and when I was in high school, that old man who got angry at us passed away. Thinking it was too good of an opportunity to pass up, I decided to ask my parents about Doudou after the funeral. Normally, they looked kind of fed up with my interests in that sort of stuff, so I thought they'd just ignore me. But they didn't. "You still remember that?" "Fine, we'll tell you, but don't talk about it too much, okay?" And so, they told me about it. Nobody actually knew what Doudou was. Even though it wasn't something intentionally passed down, somehow children always knew of its existence. The one thing these stories always had in common was that Doudou appeared around evening time, while children ran around screaming its name. Apparently, the same thing that happened to Kay had happened to other kids, and the chief priest had to cleanse them too. He probably knew something about it, but he never spoke of it publicly. Perhaps it wasn't something to be spoken of openly, and that was why I shouldn't speak of it anymore either, they said. The serious look on my father's face convinced me. So in the end, all I could say was, okay. I haven't looked further into it since then. Honestly, I'm a little scared to. I come from deep in the mountains of Ehime, but has anyone heard of any stories similar to this? We're heading to Ehime again for this next one, to uncover the legend of a rather interesting yokai. There's a tale told in various areas of Shikoku called the Headless Horse, which is generally ridden by a kami-sama, and not something you really want to come across. But the creature in this story is, well, almost its opposite. Find out the story behind this strange creature in Torsoless Horse. This is something I experienced as a university student when I returned home to Ehime at the end of the year. My family home is in the countryside, and although there are lots of buildings near the station, when you go just a little further out, it's nothing but rice fields. My parents' house can be found out there. One evening, I think it was just before dinner, I went to the convenience store to pay for something I bought online. I didn't want to bother them with just the bill, so I picked up a can of coffee as well, and then went outside. I'm not very good with hot drinks, so I sipped it slowly as I looked around, bored. A few new houses had been built, but it was mostly the same old scenery that I was used to. Just rice fields and not much else. The rice had already been harvested, so just the bottom of the stalks was left in the fields. And out there, amongst those stalks, I saw a figure. Looking closer, I wondered if maybe it was someone walking a dog, or maybe a scarecrow, but it didn't seem to be either of those things. At the time, I really couldn't make out what it was, but it appeared to be a horse. When I say I couldn't make out what it was, I don't mean that I was too far away to even see it. I was close enough that I could generally make out its face. But the reason I couldn't understand what it was because it didn't actually have a regular horse shape. The lower half of its body, or the rear end, I don't know what to call it, but either way, the back half of the horse was gone. And as for its face, some black liquid appeared to be dripping from the area near its eyes. I often read scary stories, but I've never once ran into anything supernatural myself. As such, I had no idea what it was. But if it was someone doing a cosplay, well, it was honestly really creepy. I threw my half-finished coffee can in the rubbish bin, and then quickly got back on my bike and rode home. I kept looking behind me on the way, but it didn't appear that the thing was following me. During dinner, I asked my mother if she knew any local scary stories. Maybe she knew something about ghosts in the area. I think I was more curious than I was afraid. But I didn't want to worry her about the horse thing I'd seen, so I didn't mention that. But none of the stories she knew seemed related. Just things like, somebody died in that apartment and now their ghost haunts it. The company dorms in those mountains over there used to be a hospital, so they're pretty dangerous. There's a tree that makes people want to hang themselves if they go near it, etc. They were interesting stories, but they'd probably be too scary if I actually went there, so I didn't exactly want to. Looking back on it now, my mother came from the city when she married my father, so she probably didn't know a lot of local legends. After that, not much happened. Although it was a weird experience, I didn't have the courage to go back to that same spot again. So I just went to my room upstairs and played video games and browsed the internet for a while. Before long, our dog started howling. I thought maybe a stray dog or cat had appeared, but then I realized there was another sound mixed in. It sounded like taiko drums being hit. That's weird, I thought. My hometown has a festival with such drums, and you can often hear them around town before the festival takes place. But that festival was in autumn. And even if it was festival season, practice only took place during the day, so as to not bother people at night. It sounded like whatever it was getting closer. The sound went from being far away to reverberating within my body. I also found it strange that it didn't wake my mother up in the next room. It was so loud. Back when I was in junior high, even the slightest noise at night woke her up and she would get angry at me for it. I pulled back the curtains and looked outside. There were no streetlights near our house, so I shouldn't have been able to see anything. But there was something faintly glowing purple in the garden. Or maybe it would be better to say that it looked like it was being lit up by a purple lamp or something. At any rate, it was that horse with no backside that I saw earlier. I quickly closed the curtains, ran to the other side of the room, sat down and looked around. I couldn't help but think that the horse was going to come in through the window, and that sound of the drums kept going too. Was the horse going around and around the house, I wondered. I kept my laptop and video games nearby, trying to distract myself, but it didn't work very well. Before long, I found myself fixating on not just the window, but the corners of the room, under my bed, etc. 2 or 3 hours passed, and then I realized the sound of the drums was finally getting quieter. Then, once I could no longer hear it, I still couldn't find it in myself to look outside to check for sure. It wasn't until the sun started to come up that I was finally able to look. The garden looked perfectly normal. There was nothing strange outside. At breakfast, I asked my mother about the night before, but she said she didn't hear anything. She also didn't know anything about any local events that might be using drums. There was a shrine near our house, and I don't know if you should visit a shrine or a temple at times like this, but after looking it up, apparently they do cleansing ceremonies at shrines, so I decided to talk to them about what happened. I visited the shrine office and explained everything to the chief priest. He seemed curious about my story. "I know about that horse, but it's strange that it followed you home," he said. But still, what I experienced really happened, so I asked if he could do anything about it. "Well, let's perform a cleansing ceremony, just in case." I was surprised that that was all he said. He then said it would take a bit of time, to which I said that would be okay. So he led me to a space with numerous chairs behind the offertory box. I remembered seeing a priest wave his staff around near that area when I previously visited for the first shrine visit of the year. I later looked it up, and apparently that was where they held exorcisms for unlucky years. The cleansing ceremony didn't take too much time. He chanted and waved his staff in front of me, but I don't really know much about these sorts of things, and I don't know what he said either. "We're done," he then said, but I didn't really feel any different. I just said, "Eh?" After the ceremony, we went back to the shrine office for some tea, and I asked him about the horse. "What you saw is called the Torsoless Horse." That name sounded familiar. I don't remember all the details, but I think I heard it at a presentation during the cultural festival when I was in elementary school. According to the priest, this horse without a torso chases children who play late into the night and then carries them away. It seemed to be a story made up by parents to make sure their kids returned home early. Apparently, a story was passed down at the shrine saying that if a child sees the torsoless horse, they must request that it doesn't take them away. And that cleansing ceremony he just performed for me was said request. Since the horse wasn't a ghost or a curse or anything like that, but something akin to a kami-sama, that request was the only thing you could do to get it to listen. That was all the chief priest knew, however. Everything else was a mystery. Nothing strange has happened to me since then. I went back to my parents' house every New Year's, but I never saw that torsoless horse again. In the end, I don't know why I saw it when I wasn't even a child. I don't know why it came to my house, and I don't know what it wanted either. Looking back on it, it wasn't really that scary of a story, but at night, I still can't open my curtains anymore. Even without the sound of drums, I fear that if I do, I'll see that torsoless horse again. The Shichinin Misaki are another famous ghost story to come out of Shikoku. For those who are unaware, this is generally a group of 7 ghosts who are constantly looking for someone they can possess and then kill to take their place in the group. The spirit at the head of the line can't move on until they find someone else to join the 7, keeping the group at a constant number. In this next story, it seems a young man encounters this group. But why? What do they really want? Find out in Shichinin Misaki. I was born and raised in a countryside village in Shikoku, so all the children always played together, and we all knew each other well. This happened about 20 years ago, when I was a junior high student, and I confirmed it with the person involved a year after it happened. There was a boy 2 years younger than me, who I'll call A. He was your average kid with nothing especially strange about him. One evening during August, the summer holidays, A was napping at home until dinner time. But at some point, he suddenly woke up, put on a hat, grabbed a torch, and then went outside. Apparently, he was half asleep at the time, and he had no idea why he woke up. One of his relatives noticed that he had gone outside, but they didn't think much of it and didn't pay him any attention. According to that family member, it was around 7 p.m. at the time. So, when A went outside, there were 6 people standing there. A didn't remember anything in particular about them, like their age, gender, etc. Just that there were 6 of them. The 6 of them acknowledged his presence, and then they started walking up the mountain. A's house was built on the slope of said mountain. Despite being sleepy, and despite not knowing who these people were, A didn't feel afraid. Rather, he felt like he should actually follow them, almost like he was getting sucked into their group. This mountain behind their house was actually quite large. The 6 people encircled A as they walked up, and next thing he knew, their surroundings were pitch black. It also felt like the 6 people around him were no longer people, but rather presences. In his head, he fully realized they were no longer people, and yet he still didn't feel afraid and kept walking. Apparently, he was still half asleep. The presences around him kept muttering and whispering about something, but he couldn't hear what. And still, he continued walking. Before long, an insect hit his torch. seemed it was attracted to the light. But the moment that happened, the 6 people around him disappeared in an instant, and he could no longer hear the voices. It was like a switch went on, and A suddenly came back to his senses. He looked around and realized he was all alone deep on a mountain path he didn't recognize. The only light around was that of his torch. Suddenly, he was overcome with fear, and he ran back down the mountain towards home. His family members were out looking for him, and it was shortly before midnight by the time he finally got back. A chief priest from the Izanagi school later told A's family that he had likely been pulled away by 6 members of the Shichinin Misaki. They were looking to make A their 7th member. If he didn't return by midnight, then he would have died. However, because his grandmother prayed diligently at their Kamidana altar every day, the Kami-sama sent an insect to help him. I remember hearing a story from our area where some women in the past threw themselves into the water after they were rejected, and ended up becoming the Shichinin Misaki ghosts. Then, after the women died, the men also started to die one after the other. Some fell to their deaths, others got drunk and fell asleep in the cold, freezing to death, etc. The men tried to get a priest to cleanse them, but he was unable to. "They are too strong. I'm not powerful enough to handle them." But this happened long in the past, and quite a few people had died since then, so we thought that the 7 men must have been amongst them, and we swam in that area with no worries. In the end, we never figured out why they came for A though. After that, A didn't experience anything weird or supernatural again, but I personally spent a lot of time fearful that they might decide to come for me next. This next story tells of an old custom said to take place somewhere in the countryside of Shikoku. People create wooden monkeys to take on negative energy, but as we all know, energy can't be destroyed. What happens if you have too many wooden monkeys full of too much negative energy? Find out in Hisaru. I was born and grew up in a countryside town in Shikoku, and when I was still just a kid, some old-fashioned customs and ideas still remained. For example, some of my childhood friends were twins, but the elderly people in town shunned them. And children who were born with any sort of disability were also called defective, meaning if you weren't born as a normal child, then it was customary to be loathed. Many people might get angry at me writing this. It's terribly rude. But these days, I don't think it exists anymore. It stopped around the end of the Showa period. Anyway, our town was quite small, so whenever a child like that was born, rumors quickly spread. They weren't persecuted exactly, but people spoke about them behind their backs and kept their distance and such. As such, people didn't want to have children that would make other people act like that. And so, a certain charm was created to ensure that pregnant women gave birth to normal children. This custom was passed down in our area as something called Hisaru. They would place a carved wooden monkey in the bedroom or hospital room of a pregnant woman, and this wooden monkey would act as a substitute for the unborn child, taking all of the negative energy away from it. In the past, when a child like that was born, it was forcibly associated with any disasters, curses, evil spirits, etc. that might happen. This was probably the case with the Hisaru as well. But looking back on it now, it's honestly kind of scary that this custom lasted in Japan until just 20 years ago. At any rate, once the monkey had done its job, then they would bury it deep in the ground. If they burnt it, the evil energies would disperse into the air, so they couldn't do that. If they tried to hide it somewhere, someone might steal it, so they couldn't do that either. And water is sacred, so putting it in the ground was the best choice. One day, I asked my grandmother about it. If you bury it in the ground, then doesn't that mean the bad energy will seep into that instead? That's true. But if it's left in the ground for a long time, that bad energy will eventually dissipate. That's why it's the best choice. But don't forget that life returns to the soil, and this then makes flowers bloom. It's a cycle, right? Disasters are the same. It's not like they ever fully disappear. The wooden monkeys are never buried together so that if they are dug up, they aren't all found at once. Meaning, there could be one buried beneath the ground I stand on right now. Just thinking about it gives me chills. In this next story, a group of kids on a school trip to Shikoku come across something bizarre on the beach. Something they still can't explain. Find out why in Stranger. When I was in high school, I stayed in Naruto City in Shikoku for a school trip. After dinner, about 10 of us went out to the beach for a walk. One guy said we should race to the end of the beach, so we all started running as fast as we could. Once we reached the other end, we waited for the others to catch up. But one guy was really slow, and he plodded along behind us. As I looked at him, I felt like I'd never seen him before, so I looked around. Everyone was already there. I froze on the spot, and then that guy suddenly turned and ran straight into the sea before disappearing. Everyone was screaming and running around after that. We contacted the police, and the Coast Guard and various fishermen checked the area, but they never found any body. Even now, we still have no idea who that was. When a child heads to a relative's house in Shikoku, it seems they come across something they shouldn't have. Something they're warned not to open the door to. But why? What is it? Find out in Motionless Shadow. This happened when I was in the first grade and stayed at a distant relative's house in Shikoku for about a week. It was lunchtime, and I was walking down the hall past the front door. The front door was made of frosted glass, and I could see the shadow of a child on the other side. They were around 110 to 120 centimeters tall, and appeared to be a boy. "Who is it?" I asked, but they didn't reply. And when I opened the door, nobody was there. I then went and told my relative about it. "If there's someone on the other side of the door who doesn't answer, then you mustn't open it," she said. I was just a child, so I took what she said at face value. Kind of like, you mustn't eat shells that don't open after being boiled, that sort of thing. I didn't find it especially strange. But now I'm kind of curious as to what that all meant. Was that shadow I saw just a hallucination? Or was it a reflection of something? Or was there a tradition passed down in that area about a yokai or something like that? Or maybe it was just to warn children not to open the door to strangers? I don't know. That family no longer lives there and has since broken up, so I can't ask about it now anyway. Finally this week, yet another old custom from a certain area of Shikoku that speaks of snakes and how one must respect them. If you don't, well, you probably don't want them turning their attention towards you. Although in this case, them turning their attention away from you seems to be a far worse fate. Find out why in Snake Familiar. I just remembered a few stories I heard from my mother and my grandmother. We're all from the Shikoku area. This might not be that scary though, so sorry in advance. So apparently, since long ago, there have been these resident snakes that people call snake familiars that you can find in big old houses. The snake is kind of like a kami-sama that brings good luck to the house. It doesn't harm the family who lives there, but instead just hides somewhere within it, and if you get rid of the snake, then your family will fall into ruin. My grandmother was the eldest daughter of 10 siblings, and they all lived in an old house deep in the mountains. One of her younger sisters got married to a man who lived not too far away, and next to them lived an old wealthy landowner. This mansion was surrounded by a stone fence, and each stone had an iris or something engraved on it. The house was also exquisite, and the family seemingly of noble birth. This house was also famous for having a snake familiar. But the daughter and the maid apparently attacked the snake with a stick and kicked it and chased it away. After that, the daughter and the maid lost the use of their arms and legs that they used to attack the snake. When my grandmother got married, she went down to the town at the bottom of the mountain, but they were also an old and well-known local family with a big house. The house next to them was also old and large, and one day, my mother said she saw a snake going between the two houses. She also said the neighbours saw it too. According to my mother, it wasn't a large snake, but it wasn't a baby either. It wasn't black, nor coloured, nor white. It seemed different to regular snakes. The neighbours used to sell musical instruments to schools and other establishments, but after that, their large store went bankrupt and they had to sell their old mansion as well. My grandmother's house had long had a dirt floor, so snakes could come in easily from the outside. And when my mother was little, she said she often saw 2 or 3 baby snakes coming in during spring. To reach the toilet, you also had to go outside and take the corridor to get there. And apparently, she once saw a large snake drop in that corridor. It stayed there for 2 or 3 days before finally disappearing. That house had an entrance, a barn, maybe a rice granary, and a stable all together. It's hard to describe, but this building was shaped almost like a large entrance with 2 separate storehouses. But it was knocked down when they renovated the house, and now that entrance alone has survived and was moved to another building. Anyway, when they moved it, apparently they recycled the tiles, and when the worker was removing them, apparently they found a giant snake underneath them. Like, it was the size of a human thigh. My mother's older brother still lived with my grandmother, and when I was little, he often told me that there were baby snakes in the shed behind that entrance. I remember one time they found a big snake in there and there was a huge fuss over it. But these days, I don't hear about snakes anymore. And whenever I go to my grandmother's house, I don't see them either. I wonder if maybe they've moved on somewhere else. A big thank you and shout out to this week's Kami tier members, Just Sawn and Emerald. It's thanks to your support, along with everyone else, that I'm able to keep doing this show, so thank you very much. Don't forget to check out Kaihan, Bizarre Crimes That Shook Japan Volume 2, out on Amazon right now. And check out our merchandise store at kowabana.store. And if you'd like to chat about this week's stories, come and join us in the Kowabana Discord. You can find that link in the description or on kowabana.net. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/TaraADevlin for exclusive bonus stories and extras, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan for all sorts of Japanese horror you won't find anywhere else. Thanks guys, stay safe, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.